And you can see the 6 populations of barn swallows that we work with. And hopefully the most striking thing you've noticed is the variation in belly color on these guys. And if you have a keen eye, you might also see that there's a lot of variation in tail length among these subspecies. And divergence in appearances like this is really the first step in creating new species. But most species on the planet are quite old, making speciation actually quite hard to study. The advantage of these guys here is that they're recently diverged, so we can kind of look at this process as it is continuing to happen. So I was really interested in trying to understand why these populations look so different and how that information could be used to address that mystery of mysteries on a broader scale. So I started by focusing on how color is actually produced, and the rusty brown color that these guys have is the result of melanin pigments, which we also have in our hair and skin. And for the first chapter of my dissertation, I wrote a review on the underlying genes that affect color among animals. And I was really surprised to find out that there was a lot of unknowns about the continuous or the more subtle variation that we see in animals. For example, in a population of barn swallows, there's kind of a full spectrum of shades of brown. And these 2 guys here represent extremes in our local population. So my first step to better understand that subtle variation was to compare an individual before and after a molt, so 2 different feather growth phases. And what I found was that an individual that had the darkest feathers in 1 year had the darkest feathers in the next year. And that was true when I compared an individual as a juvenile and as an adult. And that really suggested to me that there's some internal mechanism that dictates what color an individual will develop. So my next step was to try to identify that mechanism. Let me first tell you a little bit about the dramatic lives of barn swallows. They arrive here after migration, they pair up and build a nest. The female will lay her eggs and they'll hatch, and then both mom and dad will take care of those young. So it sounds like a nice romantic story, but the truth of the matter is that some of those young actually belong to the male a couple stalls down in the barn. So that means a lot of these nests have a mix of full and half siblings. And that allows me to assess how much color is affected by an individual's genetic father and how much it's affected by his foster father who's actually taking care of him. So what I found so far is that it seems to be a kind of a mix of this nature versus nurture, genetic dad versus foster dad. And that's true of most traits that have been studied in this context. So my next step is to do some manipulative experiments to really kind of quantify nature and nurture. I did some cross-fostering where I kind of had these nests of nestlings, and I exchanged nestlings between those nests. And now I have siblings being raised in different nests and unrelated individuals being raised in the same nest. However, given all of that sneaking around by the adults, I have to actually determine genetic paternity in order to really get an unprecedented fine-scale look at how environment and relatedness affects color. So another really cool thing about the barn swallows is that these different subspecies, in those subspecies, females prefer different traits in their potential mates, kind of like how some people are attracted to a good sense of humor, other people might be attracted to a good head of hair. Here in North America, these barn swallows are attracted to the darkest males, but in Europe, the females prefer the males with the longest tails. So I repeated this cross-fostering experiment in the Czech Republic where the birds are much lighter. And by comparing the role of nature versus nurture in coloration between these subspecies, I can get a better understanding of how color varies across populations, why females might have different preferences for color in different populations, and really start to get a better understanding of why divergence is happening in these populations. And funding from this award would go toward those genetic analyses that I need to do to determine paternity. And as these traits in barn swallows are quite representative of many traits in other animals, we can really get a good look at the speciation process, hopefully making it less mysterious. Thanks.